Bionicle Adventures 2 Trial by Fire. Written by Greg Farsty. Recording by Dungeoneer Harold. Chapter 12. Outside of the great furnace, the Matoran Nui split apart to become 6 Matoran again. They blinked and stumbled, drained from their experience. "That was incredible! The power!" said Eerie. "Let's do it again," said Vishula. "Think of all we could do for our city." Acmo shook his head and backed away. No way. If you 5 want to risk your lives, go ahead, but count me out. I'm looking out for what's most important. Me. "Then go," said Tahuti. "If unity, duty, and destiny mean nothing to you, run back to Pometru, Acmo." The Pomatoran laughed. "We'll see each other again. Don't worry. And then we will see just whose destiny will win out." With that, Acmo turned and fled into the shadows. The Toa Metru stood in the midst of a nightmare. The massive inner chamber of the great furnace had been transformed into a sanctuary for the king root of the Morbuzakh. Dominating the room was a huge, thick, winding stalk that extended from the ground all the way to the rooftop. The winding stripe that ran down its length marked it as the source of the Morbuzakh plague. Branches extended all along the root, entwining themselves with the masonry of the walls and floors. The king root had truly become a part of the great furnace. The Toa Metru could imagine each of those branches extending beyond the furnace, with multiple vines sprouting from them to threaten Metru Nui. Waves and waves of intense heat washed over the Toa. Already Nuju and Wunua were beginning to weaken. Vukama turned to the toe of water, saying, "Nokama, you must use your power to try to keep us cool. Can you do it?" "I don't know," replied Nokama. "I will do my best." The toe of water concentrated, calling on her energies to condense the moisture in the air into a cooling mist. It was an enormous drain, with the heat taking its toll on her as well. She could not help but wonder how long her strength would hold out, and what would happen if she fell. Vukama felt overwhelmed. The king root was far bigger and more frightening than he had ever dreamed. How could 6 discs, even great discs, bring such a monstrosity down? But what choice did they have? "Ready the discs," he said. "We will strike together, and—" "No!" The voice cracked like lightning in the minds of the Toa. "You will not destroy the Morbuzakh." "What? Who is that?" said Anua, looking around. "It was I," the voice boomed again. "Mata Nui," whispered Nukama. "It's the Morbuzakh. It speaks." "Yes, I speak. I think. I feel. And Metru Nui shall be mine." Vukama could see no eyes or mouth anywhere on the root. It was not truly speaking. The Toa were simply hearing its thoughts. Worse, they could sense its feelings. An overwhelming hunger to possess the city and drive away anything that was not Morbuzakh. There was more there as well, traces of another intelligence, but they were too vague for the Toa to comprehend. "My arms extend to every part of this city," the Morbuzakh continued. "I am in the furnaces, the canals, the chutes. The Matoran live and work only because I choose to let them. But if they anger me—" A vine suddenly shot out of the wall, wrapped around a pipe, and crushed it to dust. "First, I will drive the Matoran away from the outskirts of the city, so they cannot escape. Then I will claim this place as my own. Those who survive can serve the Morbuzakh or perish." The full horror of what they were hearing struck the Toa then. This was no mere overgrown menace, like the wild Rahi beasts that sometimes appeared in the city. The Morbuzakh was intelligent, cunning, and evil beyond anything they had ever imagined. None of them doubted that, if allowed to spread unchecked, this thing would do what it promised. Metru Nui would fall, and the Matoran would become slaves of the Morbuzakh, or worse. So shocked were the Toa Metru that none of them noticed a vine creeping up behind Whenua. It struck amazingly fast, ripping the great disc from the Toa's grasp and snaking up toward the ceiling. Whenua shouted and grabbed the vine, which lifted him high into the air. Nuju ran, leaped, and caught Wenua's legs. He too was yanked off his feet and up toward the ceiling. The Morbuzakh vine whipped around violently in an effort to shake the Toa off. "Hang on!" shouted Nuju.
"Thanks, that was my plan," said Whenua. "Did you come up here just to tell me that?"
Down below, vines had wrapped themselves around Vakama and Anawa, but Matau had proven too fast for them. The Toa of Air darted across the floor, heading straight for the King Root. "Morbuzakh! Mita Toa Hero!" Before Matau's startled eyes, a new vine grew out of the root. Before he could change direction, the vine swatted him out of the air and sent him crashing into the wall. Nokama, still straining to maintain her power, watched as Vakama's fire and Anua's stone failed to make the vines break their grip. Above, Nuju had called upon his ice power, but it was too weak to free him and Whenua. "This is all wrong," she thought. "We are all fighting individual battles instead of working as a team. There has to be a way to stop this thing." Ignoring the possible consequences, Nokama suddenly dropped her efforts to keep the Toa cool amid the awful heat. She fired a stream of water up toward the vine that held Wenua's great disc, shouting, "Nuju, freeze this!" The Toa of Ice did as she asked, forming the curving stream of water into an ice hook. Reaching out and grabbing it, he used the ice to pull the end of the vine close. "Whenua, now!" Whenua thrust his earth-shock drill forward and sliced through the vine. The portion holding the great disc fell away and plunged toward the ground as the vine writhed. Nokama glanced at Matau, who had finally regained his feet. Her eyes met his, and she knew he was ready. He raised his arrow slicers and hurled a blast of air at the falling vine, blowing it toward Nokama. The toe of water caught it on the fly, tore the vine loose, and held the great disc up proudly. "Your first defeat, monster!" she shouted at the King Root, "but hardly your last."
"You can delay me, but not defeat me."
The Morbuzakh's voice sounded like a swarm of metallic hornets.
"I am a part of Metru Nui now. I am this city, and it is me."
"Then we will tear you out by the roots, Morbuzakh," Vakama shouted. "One way or another, your reign ends today." The vine holding Vakama swung him close to the body of the King Root. Vakama took the opportunity to toss fireballs at the Morbuzakh, but the plant simply absorbed them.
"Yes," said the Morbuzakh. "More fire feeds me."
Whenua looked down at Matau, who nodded. Then the toe of earth let go of the vine, sending Nuju and himself plummeting toward the ground. When they were midway through their fall, Matau sent two mighty gusts of wind toward them. The wind caught the two Toa and flung them across the chamber right at the vines holding Vakama and Anawa. Toe of Ice and Toe of Earth slammed into the vines. The impact freed the two trapped Toa, who dropped to the ground. They had no chance to rest, however. Morbuzakh vines were now coming from every side, trying to grab the Toa or their great discs. Now began a desperate struggle, for the Toa Metru were not facing just one powerful, if immobile, enemy. They were fighting the 1,000 arms of the Morbuzakh, each as strong as the last, which struck and then slithered away. Toa tools flashed. Fire, ice, water, stone, earth, and cyclones filled the air. But for every vine the Toa struck down, 3 more rose to take its place. Eventually the Toa began to tire. Without extensive practice in controlling and rationing their elemental energies, their powers began to run low. Little by little, the vines drove them away from the king root, growing bolder as they sensed the Toa slowing down.
"You cannot stop me," hissed the Morbuzakh. "You have not the strength. That is all right. Too weak to be heroes, perhaps. But you will still make excellent slaves."
"He's right," said Vacama. "We can't win this way." Onawa drove off another vine and looked at the Toa of Fire in disbelief. "This was your idea, and now you're quitting? What kind of Toa are you?" "Stop fighting," Vacama said flatly. "It's our only chance." "You have gone around the chute," said Mattel. "We stop hard fighting, and the vines will overwhelm us and drag us to the—" The Toa of Air suddenly stopped, and a broad smile appeared on his face. "For a fire spitter, Vacama, sometimes you can be almost as quick-smart as a Lematoran." Vacama checked to make sure that all the Toa had their great discs in their hands. Then he shouted, "Now!" As one, they dropped their Toa tools and stopped struggling against the vines. At first, the Morbuzakh did not seem to know how to react. When the king root spoke in their minds, there was confusion in its tone.
"You would not surrender? This is some trick. My vines could crush you where you stand."
"Then do it," said Nokama. "Don't just talk about it."
Maybe when we're done here, we could transplant this thing to Ga Metru," Winua suggested. Add it to the garden near the canals. Gamatoran could climb it and build root houses."
"As long as it stops speaking," said Nuju. "There is nothing I dislike more than a talkative shrub." "Do what you like, Morbuzakh," snapped Onua. "I would rather be fed to the great furnace than live in a city run by an obnoxious, foul-smelling, overgrown pile of vegetable matter good for nothing but clogging canals." The Morbuzakh's bellow was so loud, the Toa thought surely their heads would split open. 6 vines shot around and wrapped around the hero's waists, hauling them through the air toward the king root. The pressure of the vines was tremendous, threatening to squeeze the air out of the Toa's lungs.
"Before you serve, you will suffer."
Vacama held up his great disc as the other Toa did the same. "No more, Morbuzakh. You have had your season. The time for the harvest has come." Pure power flashed from the 6 great discs, blindingly bright bands of energy that twisted around each other. Lightning flashed wherever 2 bands touched, striking at the vines that reached for the Toa. Then the energies blended together, forming a sphere in midair that moved slowly and inexorably toward the Morbuzakh. Desperately, the Morbuzakh tried to escape its own end. It writhed, the sheer power of its vines pulling down the walls of the great furnace. Masonry rained down from the ceiling as the plant's upper branches tried to batter their way to freedom. Great blocks of protodermis crumbled and fell into the flames, consumed in an instant, and still the Morbuzakh struggled. It had truly become one with this fortress of fire, and now both were about to fall. Taking advantage of the distraction, the Toa fought their way free of the vines that imprisoned them. Vacama looked up and saw that power no longer flowed from his great disc, nor from any of the others, but the sphere still existed, growing larger and larger every moment. "Toa, we have to go, now!" he shouted. "The Morbuzakh will bring the great furnace down upon us." Then came a sound the Toa Metru would remember for the rest of their lives. The sound of the king root screaming. That put an end to any arguments there might have been. Instead, the Toa raced for the exit to the outer chamber, pausing only to pick up their tools. They did not stop running until they were far from the great furnace and the thing that had dwelled inside. Only Vacama dared to look back. Through the crumbling walls, he could see that the energy sphere now encompassed the king root. Its walls had sliced through the multitude of vines, the high branches, and the deep roots that anchored the Morbuzakh in the ground. All around, the plant growth that had menaced Metru Nui was writhing and crumbling to dust. The king root hung suspended in the air now, trapped within the energy sphere. Cut off from the ground below and from its branches and vines, the root could no longer draw energy from the fires of Ta-Metru, or feed it to the rest of the plant. It was alive but isolated, a creature once connected with all of Metru Nui and now utterly alone. Eventually, its howls of rage began to fade away in the minds of the Toa, replaced by the sound of their own thoughts. The great furnace was now nothing but rubble and flames. The sphere glowed amid the wreckage as the struggles of the king root ceased. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the energy was gone. The king root struck the ground with a resounding crash, and then crumbled to nothing before the Toa of Fire's astounded eyes. All around the city, Matoran looked on in wonder as the Morbuzakh vines turned to dust. Soon there would be no sign of the plant left, except for the damage it had done. But the defeat of the Morbuzakh would not bring back all the Matoran who had vanished since the vines had first appeared in Metru Nui. Back at the ruins of the great furnace, Nokama looked at Vakama. "Is it really over?" "Yes," said the Toa of Fire. "With the king root gone, the rest of the Morbuzakh should soon follow. We have passed our first test as Toa Metru." "Then why are we standing here?" asked Matau. "Let's bring these ever-powerful discs to the Colosseum and tell the world we are Toa heroes!" The 6 Toa Metru looked at each other and smiled. Matau's idea sounded like a good one. After all, despite their differences, they had found the great discs, defeated the Morbuzakh, and saved the city. As they walked away from the site of their first great victory, they knew they were no longer the Matoran they had been, or even the new Toa they had become. They were heroes of Metru Nui. End of chapter 12.